Steve is going to talk right now. Thank you so much, Al. When I read, who watched the video of Steve's dad? Anybody? Raise your hand up high. Okay. So, Steve, if you could, within 5 minutes, give details of some of the atrocities that your father went through, please.
Okay. I want to thank each of you for coming today. Again, my name is Steve Finkelman. My father was a survivor, Wolf Finkelman. He passed away about 5 years ago. It looks like most of you guys are at least 16 and a half, which is the age my dad was when he was liberated. And actually, he was liberated from a sub-camp in Mauthausen, very similar to Al. In fact, Al ran an orchestra here for many years, and his band played at my bar mitzvah and my parties. So we've gone back that far. But my dad and him were liberated from very close to each other, a sub-camp of Mauthausen, a different one. Mauthausen had, most of the major camps had anywhere from 30 to 50 sub-camps located around that area. So my dad was liberated by the U.S. Army, also by the 71st Division, in a sub-camp of Mauthausen called Gunskirchen. So how did he end up there? So my dad was born in Poland, pretty far away from there, in a little town, little village called Savin, and it's close to the Ukrainian border. And he lived there. He had 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and a lot of family there. And when he was about 5 years old, his family moved to another town called Glogov, which is further south in western Poland. And they were there for a couple of years, and then the Nazis came and took over. And from there, his family was sent to a ghetto in a larger town, because that was basically the program of the Nazis, was to move the Jews from their small villages and concentrate them in larger towns in areas called ghettos. And from that ghetto, my dad's parents and his sisters and 1 brother were deported from there to another one of the death camps called Belzec, which you may have heard of. And but my dad and 2 of his brothers hid there. They hid on top of a rooftop, and they were able to survive then. From there, though, this town, the ghetto, was entirely closed up later on, and they were sent to another transit camp on the way to Auschwitz. But from that camp, my dad's older brother stayed behind there. He stayed behind to help clean up. And actually, I was going to back up in a second, maybe answer a question that was asked before, because it's actually one of the good things a Nazi did to help out. My dad had been shot in the ghetto just at random by a Nazi soldier. His older brother snuck him out of the back and into the hospital there. A Nazi helped him get him to the hospital, and he actually took the bullet out of his ankle. So there are cases, again, not a lot, but there were some. But that's one of the ways that my dad survived. So moving back forward, they were in this transit camp, and from there, my dad's older brother stayed behind to help clean up, and we know afterwards those boys that stayed behind were taken to the forest and shot. So at that point, my dad and his younger brother arrived at Auschwitz on a train, and they go through the selection there with Mengele. My dad's younger brother was too young. He was a child, so they sent him straight to the gas chambers. So my dad was sent to a work camp, another sub-camp of Auschwitz. And later on, in January 1945, when the Russians were starting to come in, closing in on Auschwitz, there was these death marches, which probably Al was on the same one, where my dad was sent to Mauthausen. In January of 45, he was sent away from Auschwitz because actually Auschwitz was liberated in January 25th of 45. So just a few weeks before then, my dad was sent to Mauthausen. And from Mauthausen, he was sent to the sub-camp called Gunskirchen, and that's where he was liberated, where I started off. He was liberated by the American Army in May of 45. And yeah, I think you heard every story is different. One thing, some of the survivors say they were smart, intuition, but the main thing they all say is that it was only by luck, only by the grace of God that they survived. because so many things happened, so many things could have happened another way. You know, that bullet that my dad was shot with could have gone a little bit more. I mean, my dad got typhoid, and he was able to survive, overcome that. So he came to America with nothing. Actually, he had probably about $2 in his pocket. He sold his cigarette rations on the ship on the way over. And then he had a really good, fortunate thing happen to him. He ended up getting sent to Houston. And again, he had nothing. He went to high school and rebuilt his life, married my mom, had 3 children, and rebuilt his life and rebuilt the business, rebuilt the family. So I'm glad that without that, obviously, I wouldn't be here either. So again, I think that's it.
He was such a nice man.
Yeah.
Since you more or less grew up in an area after Nazi rule, what was it like in this time? Was discrimination still present?
I think it was. I mean, my dad was pretty young still at the time, so most of his life, I mean, he was, there was increasing amounts of segregation in the schools in the town where he grew up, and then they were, of course, sent to a ghetto where it was very obvious, and I mean, they were segregated entirely, and he was still pretty young. Like I said, he was 16 and a half when he was liberated. He was like 12 or 13 when the war began, so most of his life, he at the beginning, his first years, there was none. He got along great. The town where he was born in was about half Jewish, half Christian. There was no problem at all. My dad went to pretty much a secular school there, and they played with the kids. They had mixed classes, teachers. There was absolutely nothing. It was only later on that it started.
There are some people who deny the Holocaust even occurred. What do you say to these people?
Well, I think we have one thing, and I'm really sorry that chick got sick and wasn't able to come here today, because people say that about survivors, that they were hallucinating, they were making things up, but we have the testimony of liberators, and we have documentation, we have Nazi documentation that shows it, but the liberators, the word of the liberators is maybe as close to the Word of God as we can get to here on earth. And they're impeccable. They're what they did for our country and what they saw with their own eyes is beyond any kind of questioning. So I said, I mean, it's clear to see documents from the Nazis. They were very good about documenting their atrocities. They planned to open up a museum to the people who they had murdered. That was part of their plan. So they did a real good job creating their own documentation.
We have a similar story. Your father was 16. My father was 17. For most of my students know this, I'm the liberator's son here. 17 years old, second day Dachau, pulling dead bodies off of rail cars. Sat in the middle of the selection area on his helmet and cried and cried and cried. People crawling up to him, I'm known in a lot of the circles as the son of an angel, because these were angels that broke through these gates, there's no doubt. Some even call me the teller of the story, which is one of the proudest things I'm proud about. But what's amazing is that my father didn't start talking to me until about 10 years before his death. He didn't want to talk about it, not at all. And he found out I was majoring in history. I'm definitely a late bloomer. We sat every Sunday for a while, and he could talk for 10 minutes, and that was it. And we had to change the subject. Now, what's amazing is that for you who don't know me, and my students know me very well, there's not, I never sit down, and I never stop talking. Well, that was my father before he went. That's how much it changed him. He became very solemn, very quiet, and he did not want to talk about it to me. He was still trying to save me. My first trip to Auschwitz, he told my wife, not me, well, don't let it get to him too much. Still carrying that. So they're telling me that I don't even know my father. When people say things like the Holocaust didn't exist, well, I get a little upset. I try to quell that as much as possible. But there are so many people, whether you're a survivor, survivor's children, a liberator, liberator's children, a perpetrator's daughter. We know these things. I think it's up to us to keep doing things of this nature, keep teaching this class, and people speaking out on it. It's difficult to carry on your father's legacy due to many people being unwilling to share their stories, although much progress is being made. Why do you think survivors are at times afraid or unwilling to share their stories?
Well, it's obviously very painful for survivors to tell their story. And by and large, for the most part, because I grew up with all survivors' families. I didn't even realize it when I was growing up. These were most of our friends. But their first priority was not to dwell on what happened to them back then. Their first priority was to move forward, was to rebuild their families, rebuild their societies, rebuild their, and move forward. And only then, I think, that the pain of going to their graves without telling their story became more painful to them than actually telling the story. So it's I know in history, it's probably over the last 30 years, probably the first 20 years after liberation, there was not a lot of storytelling. There was not a lot. They were really focused on rebuilding themselves, moving forward. After that, with the luxury, once they'd secured their future in the present, then they had the luxury of going backwards and dealing with what had happened to them.
What was the biggest factor in continuing or convincing you to carry on the legacy of raising Holocaust anti-Semitist awareness? Because I know you're very, very big in this field.
Well, you'll hear from my friend from Francisca in a few minutes. I think we have something in common that we both feel. I don't want to take anything away from her. I kind of feel this weight on my shoulders. It's not totally voluntarily. Voluntary. I mean, I could shrug it off if I want to, but I feel this strong obligation to tell the story, to share what happened to my dad, and make it my own. And it's just one of those things that becomes part. I think I have a special obligation to do that.
During your father's speech for the Kristallnacht Memorial, he stressed the importance of not forgetting the individual lives that collectively make the 12 million people murdered by the Nazis. As his son, what do you think we should do to ensure that the Holocaust does not become a footnote in history, but an integral part of time period?
Well, one of the things when you talk about, 6 million, it's like a huge number. You can't really relate to it. But when you talk about like 6 million ones, each family, each person, that's what's important to tell those stories. You've heard a couple of stories here today, and that first-hand testimony is really important to be able to convey, really, and to really understand what it means. All the families that were affected, the children, the grandchildren, great-grandchildren that never saw the light of day. So that's why I think it's real important to tell that in a real personal, individual manner.
We saw a lot of this question here, and it's understandable with you guys, you young folks in here. What values do you look for in a leader to ensure a dictator will not rise within our own country?
I think you need honesty, integrity. You need someone who will stand up. Most important thing, someone who will stand up and say the truth, say things that are not popular. I think what we find is that the way that the Nazis rose was not because there was so many bad people. There were a few who came onto leadership, but it was mostly people who are afraid to stand up and say, this is wrong. We can't allow this. And we see this today also. I'm involved in some groups, and I see these people, and I tell you, when you see something like this, you need to stand up and call it out because you know better than that. And that's really the key to not being a bystander, as they say, but actually taking action. The fact that you're here today means that you're listening and that you hear. And everybody has their own mind, and it's easy to go along with the crowd when they say something. It's very difficult sometimes to stand up and say, this is wrong, guys. This is not the traditions that we live in, that we were taught. It's not the values that this country was built on.
I've got one more here. How should we respond to international humanitarian abuses?
Obviously, a very, very difficult question. I'm not always so sure that we need to open our own borders and just say, just come in. But on the other hand, we're not free to not work on these problems and help these countries, help stabilize situations, create environments where these people can, because we're all, everyone's, I believe we're all created in the image of God, and everybody's entitled to, to life and liberty, pursuit of happiness, as we have in our own declaration. And whether it's, they're obviously, on a practical basis, we just can't open our gates and say, everybody come here. But on the other hand, we're not, we have to deal with the issue of trying to create a place. We can't close our eyes to the problem either. So there's lots of different things that I know our country's doing, but we need to do also and support that to help these people so that they can, live without being afraid of their lives.
Thank you, Steve.
To what extent has your number that the Nazis gave you at Auschwitz affected your life and how you see yourself?
Well, it's being in the camp, it gives you a lasting impression. Once you, an actual inmate in the camp, it's something you never forget. It's a lasting impression, and I have no pleasant memories whatsoever being in the camp. Every memories I have is pretty sad. But what is you actually referring to?
To the numbers that the tattoos of the numbers they put on your arms, the tattoos of numbers.
I don't have any tattoos. I don't know why. What I do have, I have a piece of shrapnel in my chest. On June the 8th, 1944, the American Air Force, by mistake, bombed the Mel concentration camp. And we lost over 500 people. And I didn't know till after the war that a piece of the shrapnel is in my chest. So that's my tattoo.
Did your father have a tattoo? How did it affect his life and how how he saw it?
First of all, everybody in the camps got a number, but as far as I'm aware, only Auschwitz actually tattooed the number on the arm. Only later on, only later on in the war. But then later on, probably when Al got there, things were starting to fall apart already. So some of their systems were not actually working as well as they had earlier. I'm not aware that the actual number. My dad always had it on his arm, but I think he kind of got used to that number itself. I don't think it affected anything. I mean, we would see it. So.
5 days, and they shipped us out. And then after that came outhouse and milk and so forth. So that's why I didn't get a tattoo.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it affected other people who would see it sometime and ask him.
Thank you very much.
Well, I have two different questions. One is for Mr. Al. Like you said, you're pretty humorous. Like I see myself as pretty humorous too, since like knee high to like a jelly bird, and I just like life to me is like it's real, as I get older, and I have a son. I'm 17, but like over the years, like I'm developing and knowing like when it's time to play, but not really knowing like the right time to like be humorous. Like, well, my question is, how would you say through all you've been through, you can like, was you laughing then, like when it was going through, just to keep the faith and keep joy, or no? Like, what made you start being humorous?
It's two kind of people, the optimist and the pessimist. The pessimist who thinks everything is bad all the time and there is no hope for anything. And usually they fall by the roadside. And the optimist is try to make a life for himself, and that's what I did. You know, I never said the cup is half empty or half full. I had to face the reality.
And I guess it's for you too as well. Well, all of you really. Like how I guess telling the story, like, does it does it hurt y'all still like to tell the story, or like do you feel more comfortable now to do this like more often, like just to let people know what you've been through, like?
Question was, does it hurt for me to tell the story? Well, it's never pleasant to talk about anything bad, but on the other hand, who would tell the story of not somebody who went through it? So I never volunteer to go out and talk about the Holocaust. I only respond. I never call anybody, I want to go and talk to you about the Holocaust. But if somebody called me, would you talk to my group about it, what you know and what you went through? That's the big difference. I am willing to respond, but I don't like to volunteer doing it.
Let me just add, I think each person has their own way of responding, of dealing with it, and each person makes their own decision. In my dad's case, he's when I was in high school, I remember he was already going out speaking about it. He felt the importance of that and the ability to do that. And in fact, later on, he would take a group of survivors from Houston, about 3 or 4 survivors, and they'd go down to Corpus Christi every year for about a week to speak to the kids in the school there. So it's a very personal thing. But like I said earlier, it's a balance between the need to tell that story, the pain of that, versus the pain of not telling it.
Visit www.marchofremembrancehouston.org, www.marchofremembrance.org for information on an event in your area. Hear Holocaust survivors, World War II veterans, and/or their families share their experiences as victims and liberators. Experience heartfelt testimonies, healing, and hope. Rise up and march against today's anti-Semitism. Marchofremembrance.org, marchofremembrancehouston.org.